This message comes from Capital One. The Capital One Venture X Business Card has no preset spending limit, so the card's purchasing power can adapt to meet business needs. Plus, the card earns unlimited double miles on every purchase, so the more a business spends, the more miles earned. And when traveling, the Venture X Business Card grants access to over 1,000 airport lounges. The Venture X Business Card. What's in your wallet? Terms and conditions apply. Find out more at CapitalOne.com/VentureXBusiness.
Hey everyone, Sebastian here. I just wanted to let everybody listening know that I'm going to be a featured speaker this year at the Intelligent Speech Conference. The Intelligent Speech Conference is an online conference that brings together a diverse group of podcasters and other content creators and their fans. It's going to be held November 4th, and it's entirely online this year. The theme for the 2023 conference is contingencies, when history meets the backup plan. I'm going to be giving a keynote address and participating in a round table with History on Fire's Daniele Bolelli. So if you think you want to participate, go to intelligentspeechonline.com to get the early bird tickets now. Also, use coupon code FAKE to save 10% on your ticket. If that sounds cool to you, I'll see you on November 4th. Have you ever heard of the leather jacket scam? It's a classic grift used by two-bit con men all over the world. It takes only a few minutes to perform, and the most effective grifters have been known to scam hundreds and sometimes thousands of dollars out of their victims using this one quick maneuver. What distinguishes the leather jacket scam from most other quick hustles is its clever use of props, costumes, and a beguiling backstory. This scam combines the ornate trappings of a long con with the speed of a mugging. Allow me to break this down for you. In the leather jacket scam, the con artist will approach their mark quickly, sometimes on foot or sometimes in a car. This person will be well-dressed or just well-dressed enough to suggest that they are wealthy or important. On a closer inspection, one might discover that this con artist's expensive-seeming Rolex is actually a fake. But one of the keys to this grift is speed. The mark shouldn't have too much time to evaluate the quality of the costume. To that end, the con artist will claim to be in a great rush. He has a plane to catch, or a meeting to get to, or some other pressing engagement. But, as luck would have it, he's out of gas and has no cash to refuel his expensive rental car, which needs to be returned as soon as possible. The con artist will then tell the mark that he's actually just visiting the country. He works in fashion, you see, and was in town for a runway show, or a meeting with distributors, or some other fashion-y sounding thing. This grift works especially well if the grifter looks or sounds like they might be Italian. Often the con artist will claim to be from Milan, a city whose name is synonymous with fashion. Now, the fact that this person is visiting from another country helps explain why they can't take money out for themselves. For some reason, their foreign bank and credit cards have stopped working. This stranded fashion mogul needs money quickly to fill his tank, return his car, and catch his flight that he's already late for. But this well-to-do Milanese fashion guru isn't asking for charity. Oh no, he would never be so crude. Instead, because this is an emergency, he is willing to sell some of his high-quality Italian leather goods at an incredible discount. At this point, the con artist will produce a leather jacket, or sometimes it might be a pair of leather jackets. These might be pulled out of a suitcase or taken from the trunk of his presumably gasless car. The jackets will be obscured with a plastic protective covering. the kind a dry cleaner might put over your clothes for pickup. The con artist will then tell the mark that these jackets normally retail for close to $2,000. But today, because he needs this cash fast, he will let them go for a tenth of that. $200, or maybe even less depending on what you're willing to pull out of the bank. If the mark takes the bait, then the money is exchanged and the con artist makes a quick exit. When the mark finally gets a chance to examine the goods, he will discover that he is now the proud owner of two of the most shoddy pieces of faux leather crap ever put in the shape of a jacket. But if the grifter knows what he's doing, then he will be long gone before the mark finally realizes that he's been scammed. Now, when you hear about a scam like this, I think many of us think, well, that would never happen to me. Surely, I would see through such an obvious ruse. The inconsistencies of the cover story would be so obvious. The bizarre nature of the quick and dirty roadside sale would raise some red flags. Surely, only the most naive people could be fooled by such a brazenly silly con. But perhaps we shouldn't be so hasty to judge. You see, every scam and cheap deception seems obvious when you lay it all out, like I just did. And the truth about so many scams is that almost immediately after they have succeeded and the scammer has made good his escape, the stupidity of the whole thing dawns on the victim. All it takes is just a moment of reflection. I would wager that the leather jacket scam is so often successful because it employs a number of different yet complementary psychological techniques. The grifter manufactures a fake emergency and introduces a ticking clock. When you feel like you're involved in a crisis that needs to be resolved quickly, well, that can cloud your judgment. The grifter also simultaneously plays on the victim's sympathy and their greed. The mark is made to feel like they're helping someone while also feeling like they're getting the deal of a lifetime. In a way, the guy selling these presumably high-quality jackets at such a discount is the one being scammed. The grift works because the mark is made to feel like they are actually the grifter. And one should not underestimate the power of a good costume. I feel like any grifter worth their salt has completely embraced the old truism that the clothes make the man. Looking the part is half of the grift. This was certainly true in the case of one of the most audacious frauds of the early 20th century. On an October day in 1906, a carriage arrived in front of the Neue Wache, Berlin's royal guardhouse. In the carriage were the mayor of the nearby suburb of Köpenick, Germany, the mayor's wife, and Köpenick's town treasurer. At the guardhouse, the mayor and the treasurer dutifully surrendered to the authorities on hand, much to the confusion of said authorities. The mayor of Köpenick explained that he and the treasurer had been arrested and were reporting as ordered to the guardhouse. But the only problem was that none of the authorities present were aware of any order to have the mayor of Köpenick arrested. What exactly had happened here? The mayor explained that he had been surprised that morning when an army captain commanding a small squadron of soldiers marched into the Köpenick town hall, posted guards at the door, and placed him under arrest, allegedly on orders from the Kaiser himself. The captain then had the treasurer cash out all the money in the town treasury, just over 4,000 marks, and turn it over. The mayor and the treasurer were then loaded into a carriage with orders to report directly to the Neue Wache, where they were told that they would be questioned on suspicion of corruption. This was curious. Why had no one at the Royal Guard House been alerted beforehand about such a high-profile arrest? It wasn't nothing to arrest an elected official in his office, no less. So, calls were placed, inquiries were made, officials from the military were consulted, and no one knew of any order to have the mayor of Köpenick arrested. Who was this army captain? Some rogue officer settling a personal score? No. It soon became clear that the man who had placed the mayor of Köpenick under arrest was not an army officer at all. He was an imposter who just happened to be wearing the uniform of a captain. This con artist had just robbed the Köpenick townhall of just over 4,000 marks and made a clean escape while the mayor and the treasurer nervously sat in a carriage and made their way to Berlin. It would take the authorities 10 days to finally identify and arrest the so-called captain of Köpenick. The imposter turned out to be a down-on-his-luck ex-convict named Wilhelm Voigt, and by the time of his arrest, his story had become a sensation in the German press. How exactly had this out-of-work cobbler pulled off such an audacious stunt? How had he managed to take command of a very real squadron of German soldiers? Why had no one stopped him? Why hadn't anyone seen through such an obvious and brazen deception? The German media almost immediately turned Wilhelm Voigt, the captain of Köpenick, into a kind of folk hero. His life story, culminating in his audacious heist, easily fit the beats of a classic German fairy tale. There was a moral to this story, but what exactly was it? In 1906, that depended on which papers you read. Did Voigt's stunt expose the excesses of turn-of-the-century German militarism? Did it illustrate how the average German had become overly deferential to any man in uniform? Did Voigt simply exploit the fact that Kaiser Wilhelm II's Germany was a conservative police state? Or was this instead an indictment of Germany's growing bureaucracy? Was the real issue the spineless and credulous conduct of the democratically elected mayor? Had German leadership gone soft as the result of democratic institutions being infiltrated by liberals and social democrats? Depending on the political persuasion of the paper doing the reporting, the answers varied. What they all agreed on was that Wilhelm Voigt's heist in Köpenick had been very funny. They just couldn't agree on who had been the butt of the joke. So how exactly did Wilhelm Voigt pull off one of the most theatrical frauds in history? Was there a lesson to be learned from his audacious caper? And if so, what was it? Let's find out today on Our Fake History. Episode number 186, Who is Germany's Greatest Imposter? Hello and welcome to Our Fake History. My name is Sebastian Major, and this is the podcast where we explore historical myths and try to determine what's fact, what's fiction, and what is such a good story that it simply must be told. We are back for season 9 of this podcast. Holy cow! 9 seasons. Can you believe it? Honestly, I can't. But anyway, all that means for you, dear listener, is that you can expect brand new episodes of Our Fake History dropping every 2 weeks from now until our next season break in the summer of 2024. So let's get into season 9. But before we get going this week, I want to remind everyone that an ad-free version of this podcast is available through Patreon. Just go to patreon.com/OurFakeHistory and start supporting at $5 a month to get an ad-free feed and a ton of exclusive extra episodes. And speaking of extra episodes, I'm putting out a call to my patrons to start sending me suggestions for a topic that you would like me to cover in an exclusive extra episode. I will pick my 5 favorite suggestions and then let the patrons vote on which topic they like the best. The topic with the most votes will be turned into an exclusive for patrons at all levels of support. Now, I used to only do these patron-chosen episodes when I hit a new Patreon goal, but now I'm just going to make them a yearly thing. So every season, patrons will get to vote on what they want one of the extras to be on. And speaking of voting, there's also going to be a whole new batch of designs hitting the TeePublic store for t-shirts, mugs, and other merch. Our OFH artist in residence, Frank Fiorentino, wants to know which episode images from season 8 you liked the best. We will then turn those fan favorite images into merch on the TeePublic store. Now, this is for all listeners, not just patrons. So if you want to vote on your favorite images from season 8, please go to the Our Fake History Facebook group. That's facebook.com/OurFakeHistory and like the images that you want to see on a t-shirt. All right, enough housekeeping. This week, we are turning our attention to the Kaiserreich. That is, Germany around the turn of the 20th century. Today, we aren't so much looking at a historical myth as we are dissecting a famous fraud and exploring how different people can look at the same event and draw drastically different conclusions about what it meant. Now, I think we need to start today by acknowledging that the German Empire of the late 19th and early 20th century is still poorly understood by many in the English-speaking world. Despite the fact that a solid century has passed since the end of the First World War, I would argue that the Great War propaganda caricature of robotic, bloodthirsty Germans in pointed helmets commanded by a megalomaniacal Kaiser continues to color our perceptions of the Kaiserreich in Britain and North America. Now, don't get me wrong. The real history buffs and students of the era have a much more nuanced and sophisticated understanding of this time and place. And I'm sure my German listeners are rolling their eyes at those cartoonish stereotypes. But I think it's worth acknowledging that for many in the English-speaking world, the pre-World War I German Empire is poorly understood beyond a vague sense that it was a bad place. Now, this narrative about Germany was obviously supercharged by the outbreak of the First World War. But ever since the official proclamation of the German Empire in January of 1871, the new European superstate was viewed suspiciously by many of the other established European powers. From its inception, the German Empire was presented as aggressive, ambitious, and militaristic, especially in the British press, where the Germans quickly became perceived as a worrying new rival for the British Empire. To understand this story, I think it's important to remember that Germany was not a unified nation-state before 1871. In many ways, modern Germany is even younger than my famously young country of Canada, which was confederated in 1867. Before the push for unification that culminated in the creation of the German Empire, the German-speaking parts of Central Europe were a patchwork of small states, independent cities, and medieval duchies. The largest and most militarily dominant of these German-speaking states was Prussia, whose capital was Berlin, and whose territory, by the mid-19th century, stretched across the northwestern region of what would become the German Empire. To make a long and complicated story short, in the mid-19th century, the powers at be in Prussia set about unifying the German-speaking parts of Europe into a new German Empire that would be dominated by the Prussians and ruled over by the Prussian king. With the exception of a few notable holdouts, this was achieved through a combination of war and diplomacy over the course of a few decades. This unification was largely masterminded by the famous Prussian minister-president and foreign minister Otto von Bismarck. And yes, one day I really do need to do a series on Bismarck. Not only is he one of the 19th century's most important people, but he is the subject of at least a few historical myths, not to mention the fact that his legacy is very hotly contested. Anyway, for the purposes of our story today, what you need to know is that after Prussia's overwhelming victory over France in the Franco-Prussian War of 1870-1871, the German Empire was officially proclaimed in a ceremony held in the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles in occupied France. The Franco-Prussian War had generated an upswell in German nationalism in some of the states that had remained independent up to that point. In the aftermath of victory, many were persuaded to finally join a new German nation-state. The Prussian king Wilhelm became Kaiser Wilhelm I, Emperor of Germany. The unification made Germany one of the largest, most populous, and economically significant nations in Europe virtually overnight. This new state was essentially to be a constitutional monarchy, albeit one with a very powerful head of state in the person of the Kaiser. Now, importantly, there were many democratic institutions as part of the new German constitution. The Reichstag, or German parliament, was elected through universal male suffrage and had power to initiate legislation, pass, and amend bills. There was also a federal council known as the Bundesrat, made up of representatives from member states in the United German Empire. Many local governments were also democratic in nature, with posts like mayor or Bürgermeister being elected. But where the German Empire differed from other European constitutional monarchies, like that in Britain, was the amount of executive power retained by the hereditary monarch. The Kaiser had the power to execute and publish laws, appoint and dismiss imperial officials, and, significantly, declare war and make peace unilaterally. Only in very specific instances did the Kaiser need the approval of the Reichstag or the Bundesrat when it came to foreign policy decisions. The Kaiser also personally appointed the Chancellor of Germany, who presided over the Bundesrat and, as a result, wielded considerable power within the system. The Chancellor was responsible only to the Kaiser, and as such, the office of Chancellor could be used by the Kaiser to influence public policy at all levels. The Constitution of the German Empire sought to synthesize the liberal, democratic ideals that many had fought for in the revolutions of the early 19th century, with an old-school, absolute monarchy. Admirers of this system, largely conservative aristocrats from other countries, thought that the Germans had perfected this balance. The people were enfranchised just enough to keep them feeling free, while the levers of power still largely remained in the hands of the landed aristocracy and the hereditary monarchy. As such, the German constitution was used as a template by the Japanese in the creation of Imperial Japan. Russian conservatives also saw it as a model for their reform system after the 1905 revolution. As you might expect, this system had just as many critics as it did admirers. Critics of the system saw it as baldly authoritarian, with the democratic institutions acting only as table dressing. But when you look closely at the history of the German Empire between 1871 and its dissolution in 1918, I think you see a more complicated picture. These competing elements in the German Constitution, that is, the power of the democratic institutions versus the power of the traditional ruling class, created a real tension in German society. I think you can see a real push and pull between these two elements in Germany in the late 19th and early 20th century. On the one hand, you had liberals and social democrats trying to strengthen Germany's democratic institutions, push for greater civil liberties, diminish the power of the old elites, and build a more robust welfare state. On the other hand, you had conservative monarchists who wanted to stem what they saw as a rising tide of socialism, diminish the growing influence of new political parties in the Reichstag, and empower the Kaiser even further. And of course, millions of people in the country fell somewhere in between on these political questions, because, that's kind of how politics works. One way to understand the 48-year history of the Kaiserreich is to picture a swinging pendulum between these political poles. At points, the German Empire became more democratic and more liberal, but then it gets pulled in a more conservative, authoritarian direction, only to swing back again. As expert Benjamin Hett has pointed out, the day-to-day of this struggle played out in the German press as a simmering culture war that feels very familiar to someone living in 2023. Any news story of the time could be used as fodder to help make the case for one political position or the other. The audacious heist orchestrated by Wilhelm Voigt in 1906 was a perfect example of this. The other piece of the puzzle that you need to understand for this story to make sense is the role of the military in the German Empire. There's a quote that often gets attributed to the French statesman the Comte de Mirabeau that goes, quote, "Prussia is not a state with an army, but an army with a state," end quote. Now, that is one of those slippery historical quotes that always comes with the citation needed flag. I've seen that quote attributed to Mirabeau, the philosopher Voltaire, and even the former king of Prussia, Frederick the Great. In all likelihood, none of them actually said it. Still, it's had staying power because it's pithy, and perhaps it captured something about the role of the military in Prussia and then, by extension, the German Empire. Now, historians have debated how significant what we sometimes call Prussian militarism was in German culture in the early 20th century. See, at one point it was fashionable to explain both world wars as simply Prussian militarism run wild. Then, of course, there was the inevitable pushback when that old explanation was criticized as reductive and simplistic, because it was. But with all that said, I think it's still reasonable to say that Imperial Germany was a heavily militarized society. In the early 19th century, the Prussians pioneered the use of a military reserve system. That meant that at the age of 20, every able-bodied male citizen was expected to report for military service. You would be trained and you would serve actively for 3 years before returning to civilian life. But you remained a reservist until you were 45 years old. That meant you had to report once a year to your local commander. And in a time of war, you would be expected to once again report for active duty. So Imperial Germany was a society where almost every man, except those with a disqualifying disability, had served or were currently a reservist. After 1871, the Kaiser became the commander-in-chief of the military of the newly united German Empire. And so, the military reported directly to him and wasn't really subordinate to any civilian authorities. As historian Jeffrey Schneider has noted, quote, although military personnel were obligated to obey all civil and criminal statutes, as well as military laws and regulations, an 1855 cabinet order nevertheless required police officials to provide deferential treatment to officers at all times, even those suspected of committing a crime. End quote. So, while the military wasn't technically above the law, no civilian authority could challenge a man in uniform in any significant way. It perhaps goes without saying that there was a huge amount of pride in the military and an enormous amount of prestige that came with holding a military rank. In Imperial Germany, a man in uniform was a person to be respected, and every male member of society had military discipline drilled into them during their compulsory military service. The early 20th century German historian Werner Bruck summed it up like this, quote, this idea of a military machine permeated the whole social life, public and private, and even to a certain degree influenced German culture. This militarism has rightly been called the cement that bound the whole structure of society into an entity. End quote. So with that in mind, you could perhaps see how a heist that involved impersonating a military officer, cowing the civilian authorities, and making off with all the cash in the treasury of a town hall struck a chord. To many Germans, it felt less like a crime and more like a piece of satirical theater. It seemed to reveal so many uncomfortable truths about German society, with the added carnival twist of a low-status figure taking on the authority of a high-status figure. He was the fool who got to be king for a day. It was so perfectly theatrical that almost immediately after the event, it was adapted as a piece of theater. Within weeks, the exploits of Wilhelm Voigt were being reenacted in cabarets around Germany. The whole story was eventually transformed into a successful play by the dramatist Karl Zuckermeier titled The Captain of Köpenick. This, in turn, became a fairly well-received German-language film in the 1950s. However, despite the ready-made satire of the Köpenick incident, it perhaps did not move the needle in Germany's pre-World War I culture war as much as you might think. In fact, historian Jeffrey Schneider has recently argued that, quote, the incident's transformation into a popular role play engaged the public in a more stunning theater of self-deception, one that in the end strengthened rather than weakened militarism's ideological hold over German society. End quote. So, with that in mind, let's take a closer look at the life and crimes of Wilhelm Voigt and see if there's anything that can be learned from his transformation from a struggling ex-con into the Captain of Köpenick.
so many options, why choose Arizona State University?
For me, the only online option was ASU because of the quality. Their faculty was really involved with their students and care about your personal journey. The dedication to my personal development from my professors, that's been extremely valuable to me.
Earn your degree from the nation's most innovative university. Online. That's a degree better. Explore more than 350 plus undergraduate, graduate, and certificate programs at asuonline.asu.edu.
The life of Wilhelm Voigt very easily doubles as a condemnation of the harsh inflexibility of the legal institutions of Imperial Germany. Indeed, many writers, including Karl Zuckermeier, the playwright behind The Captain of Köpenick, would use the case of Wilhelm Voigt to demonstrate how the Kaiserreich made it impossible for someone who was convicted of a crime early in life to ever meaningfully reform and rejoin society. But historian Benjamin Hett has argued that while there is certainly some truth to that classic interpretation of the Voigt case, quote, the real significance of Wilhelm Voigt's journey is virtually the opposite of that which is given by historians and literary writers, end quote. He instead argues that by the end of Wilhelm Voigt's final trial, quote, his case demonstrates the remarkable transformation that was underway in the German criminal justice system in the years before the First World War, end quote. In other words, the life of Wilhelm Voigt, on the one hand, demonstrates the harshness of Imperial German justice, while also demonstrating just how much it had liberalized and transformed by 1906. But let's start from the beginning. Wilhelm Voigt was born in Tilsit, Prussia in 1849. He first ran afoul of the law at the age of 14 when he was convicted of petty theft. This resulted in a 14-day prison sentence and his expulsion from school, to which he never returned. He was trained as a shoemaker by his father, but things took a really bad turn a few years later, when at the age of 18 he was caught passing forged checks. Now, this might seem like a relatively minor crime, but because he had previous convictions, the court was able to give him the strongest possible sentence: 12 years hard labor. So Wilhelm Voigt spent all of his 20s laboring in German prison. This meant that he was unable to do his compulsory military service, which, along with his criminal record and unfinished education, marked him even further as an outsider in Prussian and then Imperial German society. When he was finally released from prison, he moved to Bohemia, where he married and lived relatively quietly as a shoemaker for 10 years, before drifting back into illegal activity. Around the age of 40, he was nabbed again for theft and forgery and served a short 13-month sentence. But it was at that time that he met another inmate named Kallenberg. This would prove to be one of the most unlucky meetings in Voigt's life, as Kallenberg managed on a number of occasions to make Voigt's situation considerably worse. On their release, Kallenberg convinced Voigt to help him pull off an armed robbery of a cashier's office at a local courthouse. Now, this might just be me, but robbing a courthouse seems like a particularly risky move, you know? Anyway, sure enough, both men were caught in the act. Now, obviously, an armed robbery is a serious crime, but this trial was a miscarriage of justice even by the standards of the time. As historian Benjamin Hett points out, Voigt's trial, quote, lasted all of 20 minutes. The court took no account of the fact that Voigt had prevented Kallenberg from killing the policeman who caught them. Furthermore, the trial record revealed some very serious procedural errors. Voigt had wished to call witnesses, The court did not let him. After he was convicted, he wanted to appeal, but the official who was supposed to draft the appeal only came to see Voigt after the deadline had passed. End quote. At least in this instance, Voigt had very clearly been failed by the system. The court gave him the maximum possible sentence, 15 years hard labor. When Voigt was finally released in 1906 at the age of 57, he had spent almost half of his life in prison. Now, fortunately, Voigt was able to secure a job in the town of Wismar, Germany, working for a shoemaker, which was a tricky thing to do as an ex-convict. But almost immediately, he found himself harried by the local police. You see, as an ex-convict, Voigt was subject to police supervision as long as he lived in Prussia. In 1842, a law had been passed in that country that allowed the police to, quote, exclude released prisoners from living in certain localities, end quote. What this meant was that if the local police in your area discovered that you had served time for a major offense, they could kick you out of town arbitrarily. You would have to leave. Why? Because ex-convicts were seen as a plausible threat to public security. Now, even though Wismar was not technically in Prussia, the police there acted as though they too had this power. The unification of Germany had created a somewhat complex tangle of laws inherited from the formerly independent jurisdictions. Prussian law could sometimes be used to trump other German legal precedents. This meant that when the Wismar police learned about Voigt's criminal past, they felt within their rights to expel him from the town. This sent Wilhelm Voigt wandering for a number of months before he finally settled at his sister's home in Berlin, where he found work in a shoe factory. But he was only there for a matter of months before the Berlin police became aware of his criminal record and expelled him not just from the city of Berlin, but from a number of surrounding suburbs. So, it's hard not to have some sympathy for Wilhelm Voigt. Even after serving his time, the authorities simply would not let this man live. Every attempt he made to make a quiet life as a shoemaker was disrupted by the cops. It was after he received the official notice of his ejection from Berlin that he started planning his ultimate heist. Now, apparently, Wilhelm Voigt had first started daydreaming about using soldiers in a heist around the time that he met Kallenberg. Kallenberg would remember Voigt saying something along the lines of, quote, "If you had some soldiers, then you could really do some business," end quote. So, in 1906, with nothing to lose, Voigt made his play. He observed the movements of soldiers coming to and from a barracks in Berlin for a number of weeks. Then he set about buying all the component parts of a captain's uniform from second-hand shops around the city. Significantly, the uniform he cobbled together passed for that of a captain from the 1st Foot Guards, which was stationed in Potsdam, not Berlin. This was a brilliant choice for a number of reasons. Historian Jeffrey Schneider explains, quote, "In selecting the uniform of a unit based in Potsdam, the fake captain gained the ability to roam Berlin and its environs without running into immediate supervisors or subordinates who might uncover his masquerade. Of the many Potsdam companies, however, he likely chose the 1st Foot Guards for its reputation as one of the most exclusive units in the entire army. Not only did the 1st recruit its officers entirely from the Prussian nobility, it did not have a single officer of bourgeois background until 1913, But as the Prussian king's bodyguards, its officers also enjoyed an especially close relationship with the monarch. End quote. This meant that in the costume of a captain from the 1st Foot Guards, his cover story that he was acting on direct orders from the Kaiser became all the more plausible. Voigt also spent some time choosing the appropriate target for a robbery. Trying to knock over a place in Berlin was far too risky. However, he might be able to overawe the officials in a small town. So he set his sights on the townhall, or Rathaus, in the small but growing suburb of Köpenick, just southeast of Berlin. On October 16, 1906, he donned his uniform, screwed up his courage, and made his move. First, Voigt intercepted 2 squads of soldiers, 10 men in total. One group was marching back to their barracks, and the other group was approached at a nearby firing range. Now, this is where Voigt really distinguished himself as an actor. Summoning his most authoritative Prussian military demeanor, he ordered the soldiers to halt, and they obeyed immediately. He then told the men that they had new orders. They were to accompany him immediately on the next train to Köpenick. Now, you might be wondering, why didn't this whole charade fall apart right here? Why did these soldiers so quickly snap to attention for an officer they had never encountered before? The answer is that is what they were trained to do. Historian Jeffrey Schneider has pointed out that, quote, complaining, questioning, or talking back to hierarchical superiors resulted in arrest, which could be increased to imprisonment for up to 3 years if done in front of others. End quote. Questioning a superior officer, even for a second, especially in public, was literally illegal if you were a soldier in Imperial Germany. Those 10 men snapped to it because nitpicking any perceived inconsistencies in an officer's uniform would have meant jail. So this small group of soldiers boarded the train with a man they thought was a captain from Potsdam and rode it all the way to Köpenick. There they disembarked and in perfect military order marched on the town hall. Voigt then commanded his soldiers to cover all the exits. Now, having a squadron of soldiers march on a town hall in Germany in 1906 was kind of a big deal. Jeffrey Schneider has argued that at that point in Germany there was a pervasive anxiety, or fantasy, depending on your political perspective, that the military might at any moment orchestrate a coup in the name of the Kaiser and sweep away the country's democratic institutions. So it was deeply alarming for many in the town of Köpenick when word got out that a group of soldiers had occupied the town hall. Some reports say that a crowd of thousands of citizens gathered around the town hall after Voigt marched in that day. Now, that number may be an exaggeration, but I think it's fair to say that there was a large crowd out front. So, to work crowd control, Voigt recruited the police constable who was on duty at the town hall that day. At trial, and then later in his autobiography, Voigt would relish the detail that he found the constable napping on duty. After waking him, the fake captain later reported that, quote, I asked him whether the good city of Köpenick is paying him to sit around here and doze, if he would be so kind to proceed outside and see that the necessary order is maintained in the streets and no disturbances interfere with traffic. End quote. The embarrassed officer sprang to attention and headed out the door to keep the growing crowd from getting unruly. So, if you're keeping track here, by this point, Voigt had managed to recruit 10 German soldiers and 1 napping police officer as his accomplices in a robbery. Voigt then marched up to the mayor's office where he confronted the mayor of the town. The mayor, or Bürgermeister, was a man named Dr. George Langerhans. In this whole debacle, it was only Langerhans who pushed back at all against the alleged authority of this mystery captain. Voigt announced that the mayor was under arrest on orders of the Kaiser, but Langerhans was suspicious. Jeffrey Schneider explains that, quote, as a trained lawyer and the co-editor of the 5th edition of a reference work on Prussian law, Langerhans knew to demand some kind of written proof for his arrest, and likely knew that neither the criminal code nor the military code provided for the military arrest of a civilian or even a reserve officer who was not currently on active duty. End quote. Now, this could have stopped the whole heist in its tracks, but this is where Voigt showed his true genius as a conman. First, when Langerhans demanded to see some authorization for this arrest, Voigt barked back, quote, these troops are my authorization, end quote. Langerhans then tried to appeal to the fake captain as a fellow soldier, revealing that he had been a lieutenant during his time in the Army Reserves. When Voigt heard this piece of information, he pivoted quite brilliantly, realizing that the better approach with Langerhans might be one of flattery. So, the mayor was a lieutenant? Well, that is exactly why the powers at be chose to send a captain to arrest him. It would have been embarrassing to have a lieutenant arrested by a fellow lieutenant, so that's why he, a captain, was here, out of respect for the mayor's military rank. This approach seemed to soften the mayor. Voigt then had the mayor swear on his honor as a lieutenant that he would not flee the building. According to Jeffrey Schneider, quote, it's worth noting that Voigt also showed the mayor the additional courtesy of sending a soldier to fetch his wife from their apartment above, and permitting her to accompany her husband in the carriage transporting him to the guardhouse in Berlin, suspecting, correctly it seems, that she would both encourage her husband to acquiesce to his demands while also distracting him from seeing through the deception. End quote. So, this was Voigt's real talent. Not only did he play the part of the gruff Prussian officer incredibly convincingly, he knew how to improvise. So he showed some softness, flattered the mayor's ego, and used the man's wife as a distraction. This is a master class in grifting. With the mayor now acquiescing, Voigt then marched to the treasurer's office where he had the official cash out everything that was in the safe. At first, the treasurer was hesitant, but the official would later testify, quote, as I expressed further reservations, Voigt said, in the case that I refused, he would have me arrested and close the accounts himself. After that, I got to work. End quote. The treasury had just 4,000 marks on hand. Voigt made a big show of ceremoniously counting out all the money, and then he confiscated it. Now, I've been trying to figure out exactly how much money this is in today's dollars. The newspaper articles from the time speak about 4,000 marks like it's really not all that much money. But I've also read that a laborer's salary in Germany in 1906 was around 5 marks a day. So I get the feeling that 4,000 marks would be like stealing $40,000 American today. It would have been like a significant amount of money, but not enough to suddenly make you rich. Again, I'm guessing here based on context clues. So if you know how much 4,000 marks was in 1906 in today's dollars, then please hit me up. Anyway, once Voigt had the cash, he had his soldiers requisition a carriage and a driver. He then loaded the mayor, his wife, and the treasurer into a carriage with orders that they report directly to the guardhouse in Berlin. Any further questions they might have would be answered there. Once the carriage had departed, the captain exited the town hall, and his soldiers helped him peacefully disperse the gathered crowd. Once the commotion had died down, he officially dismissed his 10 soldiers, ordering them to take the next train back to Berlin, where they should return to barracks immediately. In Karl Zuckermeyer's dramatization of the heist, Voigt also gives each of the soldiers a little bit of money stolen from the Köpenick town treasury for a beer and a sausage. Now, I personally wish that detail was true, but it was almost certainly invented by the dramatist to make Voigt seem all the more lovable. Anyway, after the soldiers were dismissed, Voigt slipped away. He waited long enough for the soldiers to leave Köpenick. Then he changed out of his costume and quietly caught a train back to his sister's house in Berlin. By the time that Mayor Langerhans arrived at the Berlin guardhouse, Voigt had made good his escape. Within a few hours, it became clear that the mayor, the soldiers, and all the citizens of Köpenick had been fooled by a clever imposter. This had been a robbery. Within a day, the story was all over the German papers. The fraudulent captain of Köpenick was still at large. The police released a description that, quite frankly, barely matched that of Voigt's. It was published that he was, quote, sallow, sickly, ugly, with sunken cheeks, protruding cheekbones, deep-set eyes, a drooping gray-white mustache, a crooked nose, somewhat bent and bow-shaped legs. His hands were narrow and white, his speech refined, end quote. This description is typical of the criminology of the era. It was believed that ugly, exaggerated facial features suggested a criminal temperament. This description was useless because it was skewed by stereotypes about what a criminal was supposed to look like. In fact, Voigt may have gotten away with it had it not been for his old partner in crime, Kallenberg. I told you that Kallenberg was going to wreck things for Voigt. Hoping to get a reward, Kallenberg, who had remembered that his friend had once fantasized about using soldiers in a heist, snitched on Voigt. The tip led the authorities right to their man, and Voigt was officially arrested after 10 days on the lam. But the story of the captain of Köpenick did not end there. There still needed to be a trial, and the people of Germany had to publicly debate what this whole caper had revealed about their society. So, let's take a quick break, and when we return, we will examine the fascinating aftermath of this audacious heist. Wilhelm Voigt's Captain of Köpenick heist was remarkable on almost every level. But just as remarkable was how it was received in Germany and internationally at the time. The heist itself seemed like a commentary on German culture and politics, and journalists, dramatists, and polemicists were not about to let it pass without squeezing as much content from it as they possibly could. The captain of Köpenick was the perfect subject for a think piece. And if you thought that the think piece was a recent invention, It's not. It's been around for a while. In 1906, there were pieces written about Wilhelm Voigt from every possible political perspective. But despite the diversity of the opinions on offer about the state of German culture, there was a broad consensus that the whole thing had been hilarious and Wilhelm Voigt was a lovable scamp. The fact that Voigt's scam had been non-violent, and the fact that he had robbed from the government, made his exploit seem harmless, even noble. As his trial unfolded in Berlin, and more details about Voigt's life became known to the public, he became an even more sympathetic figure. The liberal-leaning Berlin paper, the Kölnische Zeitung, wrote that, quote, "The escapade is so wildly audacious and was carried out with such unflappable calmness that, especially since it was successful, people can hardly abstain from feeling a somewhat depraved, but also not entirely inexplicable, sympathy with its architect." End quote. Even an opinion writer at the more conservative Law and Order paper in Berlin, which was clearly loath to give its sanction to a bona fide criminal, wrote, quote, "If one didn't always have to keep saying again and again that we are dealing with a crime, one could almost lament that his work only earned him 3,559 marks." End quote. Now, you might have noticed that that paper had a slightly different tally on the amount of money that was actually stolen, but you get the idea. It didn't matter where on the political spectrum you fell. It was agreed that Wilhelm Voigt was kind of a badass. The tale of the Captain of Köpenick, above all else, provoked that most German of all emotions, Schadenfreude. Now, I'm sure most of you out there know what that is, but just in case you're not familiar, Schadenfreude is a German word that doesn't really have an equivalent in English. It describes deriving pleasure from someone else's misfortune. All the think pieces associated with the Captain of Köpenick were just dripping with Schadenfreude. But what's fascinating is that depending on the perspective of the author, the target of that smug mix of mockery and pity could be quite different. From the international perspective, the joke was firmly on Germany as a whole, and the Kaiser specifically. British writers in particular delighted in what this fraud had revealed about one of their greatest international rivals. In many ways, this confirmed many stereotypes that the British had about the Germans. A 1906 edition of the Illustrated London News read, quote, "For years, the Kaiser has been instilling into his people reverence for the omnipotence of militarism, of which the holiest symbol is the German uniform. Offenses against this fetish have incurred condign punishment. Officers who have not considered themselves saluted in due form have drawn their swords with impunity on offending privates." End quote. In Britain, this heist seemed like just desserts for the Kaiser, who, it was believed, had been breeding a type of slavish militarism in his society. But in Germany, the reception was quite different. You see, in 1908, 2 years after Wilhelm Voigt was found guilty of his crime, Kaiser Wilhelm II gave the Captain of Köpenick a full royal pardon. The Kaiser even commented that he thought that Wilhelm Voigt was a, quote, "amiable rascal," end quote. The Kaiser certainly did not think that the joke was on him. One international outlet that noted the somewhat puzzling German response to the Köpenick heist was the New York Times, who ran the headline, quote, "Germany sees the joke, even if the laugh is on her," end quote. The Times' perspective was very much like that found in the Illustrated News of London. The joke was on the Kaiserreich. Voigt's caper had laid bare the society's obsessive militarism. Had it not? But the Germans were laughing. Why weren't they embarrassed? Well, I would argue that these British and American commentators were making a common mistake. They were assuming that Germany must be a monolith, and that political opinions in Germany must be uniform. They were selling short just how dynamic a place Imperial Germany actually was, and the diversity of opinion that existed among Germans. There's a lesson here that I think is evergreen. There may be a country in the world whose government may have domestic or foreign policies that you find repugnant, but it's important to remember that not everyone in that country necessarily supports their government. Modern nations are complex stews of competing visions, desires, and political beliefs. In other words, no place is just one thing. Germany was not a homogeneous bloc in 1906. In some ways, the country was being pulled in a more liberal direction at that particular moment. As such, the liberal, center-left, and overtly socialist media of the time used the Wilhelm Voigt case to score some political points. They argued that this heist had hilariously demonstrated exactly why the more conservative elements in German society needed to be resisted. They argued that Voigt's heist only worked because Germans had become too deferential to any man in a uniform. The liberal paper, the Berliner Volkszeitung, wrote that, quote, "The Köpenick swindle clearly taught, dress up in a uniform, in Prussian Germany, and you're all powerful. The uniform is the talisman that nothing can withstand." End quote. These commentators believed that the issue wasn't just deference to the uniform, but how realistic many Germans thought a military takeover of the civilian government was in 1906. The journalist Maximilian Harden, one of Kaiser Wilhelm II's fiercest critics, wrote, quote, "Everyone believed in the captain and his orders. No one doubted that the Imperator Rex once again wielded the rod. By order of His Majesty. This is the magic word that opens and closes all gates in the Wilhelmian Empire of the German nation." End quote. He would also write, quote, "Ask how such city leaders would act on the day of a military coup, and see to it whether everything else is in order in the house of your civil liberties." End quote. For Harden, this whole thing demonstrated just how plausible a military coup was in Imperial Germany. Voigt had shown everyone exactly how their civic officials would act if the military came barging into a town hall and arrested the mayor. They would only put up the most meager resistance. For demonstrating just how vulnerable Germany was to all of this, Austrian satirist Karl Kraus called Voigt the, quote, "educator of his nation." So, in Germany, there were many who believed that this entire debacle had exposed just how vulnerable the nation's democratic institutions truly were. The joke for them was on the Kaiser and his more conservative ministers and military advisors. But, once again, I will remind you that the Kaiser pardoned Voigt and chuckled at the Köpenick story. So, how did he understand this event? Well, as much as liberals and social democrats argued that Voigt's scam highlighted how unchecked the power of the military was, and how conservative elements in German society could easily upend the country's democracy, conservatives in Germany believed that the nation was drifting leftward in its politics. How true was that? Well, it certainly was true that Germany's legal system was liberalizing. In fact, historian Benjamin Hett has very convincingly argued that Wilhelm Voigt's 1906 trial and sentencing demonstrated just how much German justice had transformed since 1871. At trial, Voigt's lawyers had been able to argue fairly effectively that their client had been a victim of society. Germany's harsh penalties and over-policing of convicts had left Wilhelm Voigt with little choice but to turn to a life of crime. Significantly, this argument found a receptive ear in the presiding judge, a certain Dr. Dietz. In the end, Wilhelm Voigt was found guilty. His lawyers never tried to deny that he had orchestrated the fraud, but only that he was forced into it by an impossible situation. During the sentencing, the judge made the following statement, quote, "Mitigating circumstances are to be accorded to him on the grounds that Voigt, in fact, became a victim of circumstance and of the existing state order, and without the expulsions would still be living today as a shoemaker in Wismar. Therefore, with the expulsion, a grave misfortune came over him." End quote. In the end, the court handed down the noticeably lenient sentence of 4 years in a medium security prison with no hard labor. Voigt would famously only serve half of that sentence thanks to his royal pardon. As Benjamin Hett has pointed out, the judge's statement and Voigt's sentence is indicative of a larger trend in German justice at that time. The harsh sentences, like those received by Voigt earlier in life, were now being perceived as unjust by many German jurists. German judges were becoming more open to the idea that lawbreakers might be victims of social conditions. There were more instances of Prussian justice being merciful. For some, this shift in German justice was long overdue. But to others, this looked like Germany was going soft on crime. Indeed, in this era, right-wing critics of the justice system were starting to argue exactly that. Some German conservatives believed that the more merciful courts were part of a larger lurch to the left in the nation, and they did not care for that. From the conservative perspective, Voigt's crime demonstrated just how useless and ineffective civilian politicians truly were. The Kaiser wasn't the one who needed to be embarrassed. The mayor of Köpenick is the one who should feel ashamed. The civilian authority was the person who had been made a fool of. In fact, some conservative papers even made the case that if the mayor, or anyone else in the town hall, had been a better soldier, then they would have seen through Voigt's charade. The right-leaning Berlin local Anzeiger newspaper wrote, quote, "Since we are a people in arms, it's no wonder that the criticism turns right away to the uniform of the perpetrator, on whom a military eye would have immediately taken offense." End quote. The argument here was that Voigt's scam had shown that average Germans weren't familiar enough with correct military uniform. The problem isn't too much militarism, it's not enough militarism, because a true soldier would have known that the captain was a fake. Now, of course, this overlooks the fact that Voigt was also able to fool 10 active service members, but still, this argument was out there. This even came up when Voigt's lawyers cross-examined the mayor of Köpenick, Dr. George Langerhans, when he took the stand at Voigt's trial. Langerhans testified that he had noticed some small issues with Voigt's uniform, and had even thought that the captain may have been suffering from some kind of mental illness. The lawyers then asked Langerhans, quote, "Why didn't you call him back to reality with an abrupt comment? If you want to arrest me, then kindly first dress according to regulations and put on a helmet." end quote. To which Longer Hans replied, quote, "If I had had 6 weeks to consider it, I would have perhaps done so," end quote. For conservative observers, the mayor was the fool to be mocked here. He should have demanded that the captain dress to regulation and put on a helmet. His inability to do so demonstrated how spineless these local politicians truly were, Longer Hans' military service and rank of lieutenant notwithstanding. But it's not like those on the German left were racing to defend the mayor. From their perspective, he had too quickly surrendered to the captain. While the right painted Longer Hans as an inadequate soldier, the left saw him as an inadequate defender of democracy. Whoever or whatever else may have been exposed by this heist, there was a broad agreement that the mayor had certainly not come out well. But for my part, I can't help but feel some sympathy for Dr. George Longer Hans, mayor of Köpenick. Historian Jeffrey Schneider has argued that because the Köpenick heist was so quickly adapted for the stage, it gave the people of Germany the ability to distance themselves from Voigt's victims. Schneider quotes the German criminologist Hans von Hentig, who wrote that, quote, "We find pleasure in the good performance of a con man, but only when others, and not ourselves, are harmed or made fools of," end quote. Schneider goes on to say, quote, "The ability to laugh at these theatrical events implied a superior position of knowledge and a disidentification with Voigt's victims. Those deriving schadenfreude from a conman's victims invariably believed that they would have acted differently in the same circumstances," end quote. I think Schneider is onto something here. The writers of the New York Times were slightly amazed that the Germans didn't see that the joke was on them. But if you were living in Germany, the joke was not on you. It was on those idiots who were fooled. But here's the thing. No one ever thinks that they can be fooled until they actually are. When George Longer Hans exclaimed at trial that, of course, everything that was sketchy about the con seems obvious in retrospect, I think he revealed an important truth. The con is always obvious after the fact. I can relate, because once, in 2008, I found myself in Paris, on the Champs-Élysées, holding two of the crappiest-looking leather jackets I've ever seen in my life, and wondering, what the hell just happened? It's embarrassing to admit, but when I was a 22-year-old backpacker drifting through Europe, I got taken by the leather jacket scam. My Italian fashion mogul only managed to relieve me of the €50 I had in my pocket at the time. I mean, €50 for 2 leather Italian jackets? What a deal. Oh, yeah. Walking down one of the fanciest streets on the planet, clumsily carrying a bunch of pleather garbage, and realizing that I'd just been shaken down, was one of the more humbling experiences of my life up to that point. I remember thinking to myself, how did I just let that happen? Why didn't I ask more questions about why this guy couldn't pull his own money out from the ATM? Why didn't I notice the shoddy quality of these jackets right away? But, like the mayor of Köpenick, if I had had 6 weeks to consider it, perhaps I would have done so. Okay, that's all for this week. Join us again in 2 weeks' time when we will explore another historical myth. Before we go this week, I just want to remind everyone that I will be speaking at the Intelligent Speech Conference on November 4th, 2023. I'll be doing a keynote address, and I will also be participating in a roundtable discussion with my friend and the wonderful podcaster, Daniele Bolelli. To get tickets, go to intelligentspeechonline.com and use promo code FAKE to get the early bird special. You can only get that special for another couple of weeks until September 30th. So if you're thinking of joining us online for the Intelligent Speech Conference, please go check it out. I have a ton of shout-outs to do this week because I haven't been doing them since we ended Season 8. So listen up. We got a lot of names to shout out this week. Big ups to Vili Kotanemi, to Joy DeVito, to Mianya Perry Makatandwar, to Josh P., to John, to Kurt Smalley, to Doug Decker, to Deus, to Leonard Edgin, to Luke Larmour, to Reed, to Andrew Collins, to Michael, to Dr. Penetropolis, I like that, to John McGeehan, to Aria Lee, to Bethany S., to Ben Wonders, to Dalton Robinson, to John Corso, to Kelvin Cow, to Bill Lang, to Tara Fidlin, to Diana, to Lulu, to Jeremy Border, and to Nick and Kieran Sim. All of these people have decided to pledge $5 or more every month on Patreon, so you know what that means. They are beautiful human beings. Just going to remind my patrons that they can start sending me suggestions for the next topic for our upcoming extra episode. If you want to get in on the Patreon fun, go to patreon.com/ourfakehistory. If any of you out there want to get in touch with me, you can always send me an email at ourfakehistory@gmail.com. Find me on Facebook, facebook.com/ourfakehistory. Hit me up on Twitter at ourfakehistory. Find me on Instagram at ourfakehistory. And look at what I'm doing on TikTok at ourfakehistory. As always, the theme music for the show comes to us from Dirty Church. Check out more from Dirty Church at dirtychurch.bandcamp.com. And all the other music you heard on the show today was written and recorded by me. My name is Sebastian Major, and remember, just because it didn't happen doesn't mean it isn't real.
The news. It's always happening.
And then afterward, there's always some more of it. Wild how that works. I'm Cody Johnston.
And I'm Katie Stoll, and we are the hosts of Some More News and Even More News, the very first podcasts anyone has ever made about the news.
Every Wednesday on Some More News, we do a deep dive into a major news topic like corporate lobbying, why housing is so expensive, or Elon Musk's many, many insecurities.
And then on Fridays, we're back for Even More News to discuss the most infuriating, bizarre, and bizarrely infuriating news of the week.
Check out Some More News at Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music, or the other ones, wherever you get your podcasts.